Okay, beginning in verse 11, Acts chapter 16. It says, "From Troas we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace. And the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. 'If you consider me a believer in the Lord,' she said, 'come and stay at my house.' And she persuaded us. Once, when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune-telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, 'These men are servants of the Most High God, who are telling you the way to be saved.' She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, 'In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her.' At that moment, the spirit left her. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them before the magistrates and said, 'These men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice.' Now the crowd followed in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted, 'Don't harm yourself. We're all here.' The jailer called for the lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, 'Sirs, what must I do to be saved?' They replied, 'Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household.' When they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house, at that hour of the night the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. When it was daylight, the magistrates sent their officers to the jail with the order, 'Release those men.' The jailer told Paul, 'The magistrates have ordered that you and Silas be released. Now you can leave. Go in peace.' But Paul said to the officers, 'They beat us publicly without a trial, even though we're Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. And now do they want to get rid of us quietly? No. Let them come themselves and escort us out.' The officers reported this to the magistrates, and when they heard that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens, they were alarmed. They came to appease them and escorted them from the prison, requesting them to leave the city. After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left." Okay, so we have here three pictures, three individuals, and this is what I want to do. I want to ask, who were these people? How was it that they came to be Christians? And then what lessons can we learn? Because I'm convinced that there are some lessons to be learned if we take a look at this. So who are these people? We'll start with the very first. It was a woman named Lydia. Now, I guess because I'm a visual person, I came up with some pictures to help us kind of get into our mind who these people were. Here's the first picture, Lydia. Who was she? So hopefully you still have a Bible. I want you to look at verse 14. Said one of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. What do we know about her? Well, She's from the city of Thyatira. She is a businesswoman. Probably this is the case, a very successful businesswoman, in fact. She likely had business in all the leading cities in the Roman Empire, which means that she was a cosmopolitan woman. She carried out a business, and not just any kind of business. It says a dealer in purple cloth. This meant that she was a very successful person and very, very wealthy. How do we know that? Well, purple cloth was a real luxury item, something that was not easy to come by. In fact, let me explain the process to you. Today we have all kinds of dyes. We can dye all kinds of cloth, all kinds of colors. Not so in that day, and especially purple. Here's what happened. There were these small mollusks, shellfish in the sea. And these small shellfish had to be harvested. And I studied this. It took 12,000 of these shellfish. They had this small gland, and so you'd break the shellfish open, you'd harvest that gland, and you'd squeeze out the dye. It took 12,000 of those shellfish to make just over a little over a gram of dye. Now you can imagine a big purple cloth. If 12,000 just made a little, I mean, if you have just a gram of purple, how much of that cloth gets dyed? Not very much. And in fact, we do know this, that a purple garment, like a robe that was all colored purple, all dyed purple, was worth about 10,000 denarii, which, to put that in perspective, is about one day's work was a denarii. So probably 10 years of work. So you figure average laborer worked for 10 years, and at the end of that, if they were to save up all their money, they could buy one cloth. Now, she was a dealer in purple clothes. What does that mean? Well, it means, unbelievably wealthy. She also obviously oversaw just a ton of employees. You think about the number of employees it takes to harvest all these shellfish, to squeeze out the dye, to gather that dye together, to dye the cloth. This was a real luxury item, and she's wealthy. We know this because we see it a little later. She owns a house in Philippi, a house that's large enough for the entire church to meet in. That becomes the meeting place later. Probably she has houses in her hometown in Thyatira, there in Philippi, probably in every major city. She has a very nice house. She runs with the highest crowd. Who's she selling her clothes to? Kings, queens, nobles, people of great wealth. She's like, I don't know how to describe her. She's like a person who owns a high-end boutique in downtown Manhattan, who runs with the richest of rich people. That's Lydia. We also know, it says here, she's a worshiper of God. That's a technical term, actually. There were Gentiles who, at that time, had turned away from the gods of the Romans and the Greeks, all these myths and legends, and they began to seek after the God of the Old Testament. And they were called God worshipers. They weren't Jews, they were Gentiles, but they became very interested and often held Bible studies and prayer meetings regarding the God of the Old Testament. So she was a spiritual seeker, maybe that's the way to put it. Anyway, that's who she is. How'd she become a Christian? That's the next question. Well, let's look at it. It says in verse 13 that on the Sabbath, we, that's Paul and his companions, went outside of the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. And it says we sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. Now, likely, since these are Gentile people who had become interested in the Old Testament, likely there was a group of women, and a small group of women, who every Sabbath day went down to a certain place by the river, and they, I guess, had like a small group Bible study there. And it says here, Paul sat down. I think that's significant. If it was a large crowd, probably he would have stood up, like I'm doing now. It's very rare if you have a large group of people to sit down. Normally you stand up to give an address. That's not the context. It doesn't give a sermon. Probably he sat down with just a small group of people, and my guess is they had a conversation. There was, maybe call it some back and forth. Paul had some things to say. She had some questions. They had a conversation with one another. At any rate, it says here, the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. And that verb, to respond, actually means something like to be attracted to. There's one place in the New Testament where for someone who gets drunk on wine or is addicted to wine, that's the same verb that's used, kind of addicted. I would say it's something like this. Lydia was a person who in her life dealt with beautiful things. She was a woman of aesthetics. And here, she finds the message of Christ beautiful, something compelling. Maybe that's the best word, compelling. And, okay, they sat down and talked to each other. We don't know what was said in that small group, but maybe something of what it was that she found beautiful. We do know this. She had left the legends and the religion of the Romans and the Greeks aside. And it's understandable. I mean, the philosophy of the Romans and Greek was, I guess the best word to use is empty. So like this, there were people who they were Stoics. Why were they Stoics? They believed that life was just brutal and difficult and full of pain if your heart gets too attached to things. And so the best way to respond to just the realities of life is to keep a stiff upper lip, to never let anything get to you. I mean, there are some Stoic philosophers who actually said this, when you're tucking your children into bed at night, make sure to say to yourself, they'll die one day too, so that you don't love them too much. I mean, it's really hopeless, that kind of religious philosophy of Stoicism. There was another group of people, we'll actually meet them next week when we study Acts chapter 17, a group of people called the Epicureans. Epicureans, this is what they believed. They believed that after this life was over, just nothingness. I mean, when you breathe your last breath and you close your eyes in death, you're extinguished. And so what they said is this, since that's life, since there's really no hope of anything beyond this life, you ought to just take in whatever pleasure you can. I mean, whatever food that tastes good, whatever thrill that you can find in this life, you just got to live for the moment, because soon, you see how empty that is? And that's why, by the way, there were many Gentiles who, when they encountered the Old Testament and the God there, they said, man, forget this empty religion of the Romans and the Greeks. I want that. But especially in its form in Jesus' day, on the one hand, it wasn't empty. It was wonderful, in fact, but it was like there was this big burden. Why? Because you had the Old Testament rules and regulations, and God demanded that you be righteous. The law demanded, if you were going to be righteous, that you followed it to a T. There was all kinds of rules about what you must do. There were all kinds of rules about what you must not do. And, well, I'll just say this. Anyone who spends some time trying to follow the Ten Commandments and all the rules and regulations in the Old Testament, I mean, you'll experience them as a burden, because none of us can fulfill them. And anyway, I would gather this, that even in this room, there are some of us who are like vacillating between those two things. On the one side, it's just, you move away from an empty life. On the other side, you find kind of this religious expression that demands so much of you, and it's like you're searching. I mean, do I want life to be empty, or do I want to follow all these rules and regulations? I mean, what? And it's into that the Apostle Paul came with the message of Jesus. That God himself came in the person of Jesus, and that Jesus did something none of us can do. He fulfilled the law perfectly on our behalf. He won obedience. He won the blessing that comes with obedience. And what happened is this, he actually laid down his life for us. He sacrificed himself for us so that on the cross, God might take all our sins, all our failures, all the ways in which we fall short, and place them on Jesus' shoulders so that he might bear that burden. He suffered the penalty. He died in our place. Not only that, but he rose again from the dead, which proves that he defeated sin. He defeated death. And so it's not religion, because the burden doesn't fall on me. It fell on Jesus, but it's not emptiness. It's like this beautiful other thing. And anyway, we don't know exactly how the conversation went as they talked with one another about what the message of Christianity was, but at some point, she found it compelling. This dealer of beautiful things found it beautiful. She was attracted to it, and she became a Christian. Okay, that's the first person, Lydia. second person, there is a slave girl. So verse 16 says, once, when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. And anyway, verse 17 says, she followed Paul and the rest of us around, shouting, kind of shrieking is probably a good translation. These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling us the way to be saved. So, here's the thing. We know from the particular Greek word that's translated slave that this was not just a woman, this was a girl. So you got to picture someone probably 10 to 14 years old. We know she's a slave, so what does that mean? It probably means that her parents abandoned her. They sold her to other owners. So she's drawn a horrible lot in life, right? Her own parents abandoned her, sold her to someone else. They now own and control her. It says here that she has a spirit by which she predicts the future. Actually, the original Greek says that she had the spirit of the python, which, today, there's no modern translation that translates the Greek right, spirit of the python, because if you were to just read, she had the spirit of the python, you go, what in the world is that? What's the spirit of the python? Well, there's actually an old Roman legend, an old Greek legend. There was a person that was called the Oracle of Delphi. And this is a story that this person, the Oracle of Delphi, this guy who could tell the future, how he got his powers is this. There was this big serpent or python, and they battled, and he killed that python. And so the spirit of the python came onto him, and that's the reason that he could tell the future. And so to say that someone has the spirit of the python means that they're able to, tell the future. And that's what she was able to do. She told fortunes. And those who owned her, it says here, made a great deal of money because of this ability she had to tell the future. And she was in bondage. She was disadvantaged. She was controlled. If we were to run into her today, I think probably the first thought that would enter into our mind is here's a person who has a mental disease. She'd come across as a crazy person, someone who follows others around, shouting and screaming, shrieking. We'd probably see somebody who's not kempt, so her hair's probably undone. She probably looked terrible. This young girl, disadvantaged. Let's face the hard question. There'll be some of you who are here who will say, okay, hold on. Scott, you don't really believe that people can be possessed by a demon, do you? Anyone with a 5th grade education is beyond that today, right? To which I just say this, I do believe that. And if you don't, let me try to convince you. I think probably if you don't believe in kind of the spiritual world of evil and demons, that you might be a little bit naive when it comes to evil. This is what I mean. Today, our culture thinks that all evil is attributable either to psychology or sociology. So psychology, we can address that through therapy. We could, get someone to go through enough therapy and eventually they become whole inside. And another problem we face out there, if we just fix the structures of society, if the right political candidates get into office, if we get the right social programs going, then surely between psychology and sociology we can fix the world. We get someone enough education, they won't be a criminal, so on and so forth. You don't really think that, do you? You really think that's all there is to evil? Just, my parents didn't treat me well, and if we could just change society a little, then evil would go away? Listen, maybe I can put it this way. Every 12-step program to address people with addictions understands something about the complexity of evil. What's step number 1? You're facing an addiction of any kind. What's step number 1? Admit that you're powerless to face this addiction. You've got to see that there's no strength you have. You're powerless. What's step number 2? Step number 2 is to surrender yourself to God, to admit that there's more to this life, there's more to this addiction, there's more to this evil than just psychology and sociology in this material world, and we have to draw upon a power that's bigger than ourselves. Everybody knows that. Evil's so much more complex than just the material world we look at and we can examine through science. There is a spiritual world. There is evil that's not only in here, but out there. Anyway, having said that, just think about it. How does this person become a Christian? How does she become a Christian? Well, not like Lydia. Lydia, she sat down, there was a discussion, there was some back and forth. I would say this, the way she became a Christian, it appears as something more like a power encounter. So she had a master, she had a lord that was this demon. Paul, by the way, Paul, it's sort of a just straightforward and honest account. This girl was following them around, shrieking and shouting. He finally is annoyed. He's like, I can't take this anymore. He turns around and he says these words, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. There's a power, there's a master that's greater than what's mastering her. And the demon leaves and Jesus comes in. And so that's how she becomes a Christian. Now, person number 3, the jailer. So what ends up happening, those who owned her got really upset because now she can't tell the future anymore. They lost all their money. So they come at Paul, they drag them off, they beat them, they're flogged, probably with rods of iron. They probably broke bones, they were probably bleeding, they were tortured, and they were put in jail. It says here that, verse 23, after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. Who was this jailer? Well, likely he was a Roman soldier, an ex-Roman soldier. It was very common in that day that when you had served in the Roman military for some period of time, you'd be given a civil servant job like in a jail. So he was probably in his 40s or 50s. He knew about weapons. He knew about how to command people. He knew how to take care of bad guys. And he was in charge of this jail. Ex-military. Blue collar. He was a brutal guy. How do we know that? Well, we know that when Paul and his companions came into the jail, they were bloodied, they were flogged, they were a mess. He didn't bandage their wounds. He didn't care what they had been through. He had no regard for them, no kindness, no compassion. He was a brutal guy. It says here he took them to the inner cell and he fastened their feet in the stocks. When you picture stocks, probably you're picturing like, one of these. You've seen these before. That's not what you should have in your mind. These were chains that purposefully splayed the limbs out. And the reason they did that they were meant to torture people. As people had their limbs splayed out like that, there would be cramps. And you'd been beaten that way. It was just pure pain and torture. This guy didn't care what they had been through. He had a job to do, blue-collar, brutal guy, and, he just continued the torture of these people. And probably this is a picture spiritually uninterested. Paul sat down and talked with Lydia. He kind of had this power encounter with this slave girl. This guy wasn't a talking guy. He wasn't going to sit down and philosophize or talk about religion with anyone. He was a tough guy, probably spiritually uninterested. All right, how did he become a Christian? And here's what I say. He wasn't the kind of guy you talked about the gospel with. He was the kind of guy who you showed the gospel to. And how did they show the gospel? In 2 particular ways. Number 1, in the face of suffering, they displayed peace and joy. And number 2, in the face of cruelty, they displayed kindness and forgiveness. So, first, in the face of suffering, peace and joy. You look at this, verse 25. There they are. Their limbs are splayed out. They'd been beaten. They were in the inner cell. Verse 25 says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were, here's what it says, they were praying and singing hymns to God, and all the other prisoners were listening to them. That's incredible. After what they'd been through, they had this inner peace and joy. And by the way, all Christians have this. Because we know that we belong to God, because we have a hope, it doesn't matter what circumstances we're in, we have this sort of inner peace and joy. And that's just always there. It's something the world doesn't have. Christians have always been famous for how they faced suffering, persecution, even death. And that's the first way. In the face of suffering, peace and joy. Then in the face of cruelty, kindness and forgiveness. So there's this huge, massive earthquake, the jail, the foundations rattle, the doors fly open, the chains come off. And in that day, if you were a jailer, if you were watching over prisoners, and the prisoners escaped, guess what? Death penalty. This guy, he knows it. He's a man of honor. It says here, he's ready to just run himself through with the sword. And listen, after someone treated you that way, what's the most natural response? Well, this guy did this to me, good. Let him die, right? Let me leave. But Paul and Silas, they don't leave. They stay there. And not only that, they keep all the other prisoners there. And when this guy's about to kill him, say, wait, no one's left. We're still here. We're with you. I mean, and this man got it right away. He had treated them so cruelly, so brutally. And yet, they showed this kindness by saving his life. And he comes out, okay, you guys have something I don't. How can I be saved? And they tell him about Jesus. All right, so 3 people, they all become Christians. 3 quick lessons, and we're going to celebrate communion. Lesson number 1. The gospel is for everyone. So here are their pictures again. Do you see how different each of these people are? Let's start with race. So Lydia is Asian. The slave girl is Greek. The soldier's Roman. 3 different races. Economics. Lydia, she's the upper crust. The slave girl, she's the lowest of low class. The Roman soldier, probably a middle-class guy. Socially, Lydia, totally connected. All the powers that be know her, she knows them. Slave girl, outsider, outcast, dregs of society. The soldier, probably somewhere in the middle. Spiritually, Lydia's open. The slave girl's probably hostile, right? She's got a demon. And the soldier's spiritually indifferent. Disposition, I would say Lydia's gentle. The slave girl's mental. The soldier's brutal. I don't know, I thought that was better than you guys gave me credit for. Right? Gentle, mental, brutal. What am I saying? I mean, here are 3 people that couldn't be more different. The gospel's for everyone. Point number 2. This is the flip side of the coin. Everyone needs the gospel. It's common today to think that there's a certain type of people that need Christianity, right? Maybe it's the weak-minded, maybe it's the moral, maybe it's the goody two-shoes, maybe it's the, people of certain races, or I don't know what. But here's the point. There is no type. There is no pedigree. Everyone needs the gospel. And now point number 3. I would say Christianity is the single greatest unifying power in the face of the planet. I'll just point you to the very last verse. It says, after Paul and Silas, this is verse 40, came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met with the, here's the phrase, brothers and sisters, and encouraged them. Who are the brothers and sisters? Well, they're the converts. Who are the converts? These 3 people. Let me ask you, would these 3 people ever have anything to do with each other in like every other experience of life you've had? No way. But when they come to Christ, what are they? They're brothers and sisters. You look around this room. We have in this room people who would never have anything to do with each other. We never give each other a second glance. But Christianity does something. When you come to the foot of the cross, when you belong to Jesus, and it really comes to this.